Now we're going to do some problems where we're going to use the product property backwards. What do we do if we already have two radicals that are separate? Well, if we have the square root of a times the square root of b, we're allowed to multiply that together inside the radical and then simplify further if we need to. So let's take a look at number 17. We have the square root of 6 times the square root of 6, which would equal the square root of 6 times 6, all inside the radical, which is the square root of 36. And we all know the square root of 36 is 6. So 6 would be our final answer. This actually is a trick, and it works for all radicals, well, for all square roots. If you multiply, for example, the square root of 7 times the square root of 7, that's going to equal just a regular 7. The square root of 2 times the square root of 2 will equal 2. This works for any type of square root. Let's take a look at 18. For 18, we have the square root of 3x times 4 times the square root of x. Notice that the 4 is already on the outside, so he's going to stay on the outside of our radical. But we can multiply 3x times x together and get 3x squared. So now we don't want to leave that as our final answer because we can simplify that further. If we break it up, we get the square root of 3 times the square root of x squared. And we know the square root of x squared is x, so our final answer is 4x square root 3. Let's take a look at number 19. So for 19, we have 7xy squared inside the radical times 3 square root x. So that 3 is going to remain on the outside, and on the inside we're going to have 7. X times x is x squared, and then we still have that y squared in there. Okay, if we break it up, we get the square root of 7, the square root of x squared, the square root of y squared, which is 3 square root 7 times x times y. So our final answer is 3xy square root 7. Try these practice problems on your own. So hit pause on the video, work these problems out, and replay the video to check your answer. Here are the solutions and the work for problems 5 and 6. And let's work out problem 7 together. So for problem 7, we're going to multiply everything together since everything is inside the square root. So we end up with the square root of 150 x to the 4th y. We can break up 150 as the square root of 25 times the square root of 6. We can break up x to the 4th as x squared times x squared. And we still have the square root of y just by himself. So we end up with 5 times the square root of 6 times x times x. We still have the square root of y. So our final answer is 5x squared square root y. Now we're going to be talking about the quotient property of radicals. If we have the square root of a over b, we're allowed to break that up as the square root of a over the square root of b. This is going to help us simplify because remember, we're not allowed to have a fraction inside the radical. So if we're looking at the square root of 16 over 25, we can break that up as the square root of 16 over the square root of 25. The square root of 16 is 4. The square root of 25 is 5. So our final answer is 4/5. So now we're going to use that quotient property to help us simplify the following problems. So if we have the square root of 13 over 100, again, we're going to break that up as the square root of 13 over the square root of 100. We can't take the square root of 13, so we're just going to leave it as the square root of 13. But we can take the square root of 100. It's 10. So our final answer is the square root of 13 over 10. And remember, we are allowed to have a radical in the numerator, but we are not allowed to have a radical in the denominator. We don't have a radical in the denominator anymore, so we're good to go. Let's take a look at 21. So we can break this up as the square root of 7 over the square root of x squared. The square root of x squared is just x. We can't take the square root of 7, so we just leave it as the square root of 7 over x. And finally, our last one, 22, we have the square root of 1 over the square root of y to the 4th. We can break up, well, the square root of 1 is just 1. And we can break up y to the 4th as y squared times y squared. So, let's move our screen over a little bit. We have 1 over y times y. So our final answer is 1 over y squared. As mentioned before, radicals in the numerator are okay, but we are not allowed to have radicals in the denominator. For 20 and 21 that we just did, our final answer had a radical in the numerator, which is okay, but it did not have one in the denominator, so that's a good answer. But sometimes we will get a radical in the denominator. If this happens, we need to rationalize the denominator. This means multiplying the top and the bottom of the fraction by the same radical. And we'll do some of that on the next slide.